Salutations, brothers and sisters within the empire of the English people, also known as the King of England, Empire of Albion. First and foremost, I have to give honors to our divine creator, our heavenly father, as well as our divine earthly mother. I have to give honors to our kings and queens who have come and gone, to our saints and martyrs, to our present king and queen, to the trustees, to the heirs, to the good people within the realm on amongst the four corners, and also giving great recognition and honors to our brothers and sisters known as the Irish people who are still connected to the English people, because we all go back to the original stock, which we want to say our parent stock. And in this case, today's video is very important, especially for those of you who dwell or domicile in the territory that we call Jamaica, because you and many of you have already come to know that you do have Irish ancestry, which makes you who? It makes you the Irish people still today. And I want to go ahead and read the book, Whence, the Black Irish of Jamaica by Joseph J. Williams. And what's good about this book is because it's coming from someone who has a PhD from a prestigious university that the world itself recognizes. He's also a fellow of the Royal Geographical and the American Geographical Societies, an honorary member of the Society Academica Internationale of Paris. He's a member of the International Institute of African Languages, Cultures in London, a member of the Catholic Anthropological Society Conference, as well as a member of the American Folklore Society, a member of the American Catholic Historical Association, etc. And he's also the author of the Hebrewisms of West Africa and the book Whisperings of the Caribbean. So this is someone who actually has the credentials, and once again we say that has the ability to be able to speak on history, especially when it comes down to be able to tell us who we can actually respect in the public as well as in the private in regards to their scholarship in doing this great work, to be able to help those of us who have no idea who we are to be able to read books of this nature, to be able to get an understanding that this is who we have always been. But since we have not really been focused on it, we now have the opportunity today, because of technology and all of these various different archives online, for us to be able to actually go back and start reading some of these books that pretty much have been shrouded and been buried due, as time went by. So with all that being said, I want to go ahead and get started on this video because it's already 8 o'clock Pacific Standard Time, and I know it's about 11 o'clock Eastern Standard Time where you brothers and sisters are dwelling. If this is the first time for you just now checking the look or hearing my voice or even seeing this channel, don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and hit that notification bell, so that way when I go live or be uploaded with a new video, you will be notified. So that way you can actually be able to comment or be able to, be in real time when I'm actually doing these lives of this nature today. So for those of you who are actually on the live, don't forget to comment and don't forget to be respectful inside the chat box, so therefore we can keep this live going forward. And with that being said, don't forget, brothers and sisters, to like, share, and subscribe. Let's go ahead and get started. And so the title once again is Whence, the Black Irish of Jamaica. And first thing before I get started as well, maybe I'll wait till another time. All right, so let's go ahead and get into it. And then, as we see, before we go further, typical of the Black Irish in Jamaica, and he's speaking in regarding the brother, his dress ensemble. And we've seen various brothers and sisters throughout the various books we've read have a typical dress and what the people in that territory were wearing, especially during a certain time and era. And in this era, we would definitely say this had to be about the 20s and 30s. I may be wrong, could be 40s and 50s. All right, so let's continue reading. Introduction. Visitors to Jamaica and the British West Indies frequently remark a seemingly anomaly. In the even remotest sections of the bush and among the darkest of the Negroes, who clearly trace their ancestry back to the earliest slaves from Africa, they will find distinctively Irish names, so common that in an unguarded moment they are apt to give flight to the imagination and claim that they have actually encountered a touch of the brogue. And pause. And brogue pretty much means the Irish accent. All right, the Irish accent via the English language. A few years ago, in one school in Kingston, might be found Burke, Collins, Mackey, McDermott, McKeon, and Walsh, and with one exception, the last named, who was a dusky brown. They were, to all appearances, full-blooded Negroes. In a single classroom of another school, there were Collins, Kennedy, McCormick, and O'Hare. And here, again, in only one case did the features or complexion indicate any infusion of Caucasian blood, although this one, too, was as black as the rest. So they were letting you know that the one who also looked Caucasian actually was dark-skinned as well. Pay attention. Perhaps one of the names most frequently met with throughout the island is that of Burke. In some few instances, it is true. The name itself may be a corruption of that of a Haitian refugees, Dubourg, who came to Jamaica in the 18th century at the time of the Haitian uprising. The usual explanation given for the presence of the Irish names is, of course, that the slaves of former days were generally called by the family name of the master. But in the case of Burke, at least, we do not find a single planter of that name among the early records of Jamaica. Certainly, the survey of the year 1670 shows that at the time, not 1 acre of land was owned by anyone named Burke. And the same may be said in the case of most of the other Irish names we encounter today among the Negroes of the island. All right, so they're letting you know, or they're saying that the Irish names that the brothers and sisters in the territory we call Jamaica weren't tied to any so-called slave owner. They couldn't find any so-called planters who actually had those names. The purpose, then, of the present writer is to find a solution to the riddle, whence the Black Irish of Jamaica, and the answer, briefly summarized, lends itself to a threefold division, from Ireland through Barbados to Jamaica. And then we have on the right-hand side the table of contents. 1 from Ireland, chapter 1, chapter 2 through Barbados, chapter 3 to Jamaica. Okay, illustrations typical of the Black Irish was the front page, which we already saw. Collins, O'Hare, McCormick, Kennedy, faces on page 48. Also, Collins, Walsh, McKeon, McDermott, Burke, Mackey, their faces on page 48. So we're going to get a chance to take a look at that illustration and the images of those individuals. Chapter 1. From Ireland. Mary Gaunt, writing about Jamaica in 1922 in her chapter on the white bondsman, states, "To this boiling pot, Cromwell sent 1,000 Irishmen and 1,000 Irish women. I can find nothing but the bare notification that they arrived, and it hardly seems to me those 2,000 Irish can have helped matters much, whether they were poor convicts or political prisoners." In 1756, Dr. Brown was most emphatic in his statement, Cromwell, having had early intelligence of this conquest, Jamaica, resolved to miss no opportunity of supporting this new acquisition, which now indeed served him as another Siberia. And Edward Long, the historian, who was Speaker of the Jamaica Houses of Assembly in 1768, and writing a few years later, only expressed the commonly accepted opinion the island, when he recorded that the Council of State in England voted that 1,000 girls and as many young men should be lifted in Ireland and sent over to assist in peopling the colony. On May 11, 1655, Jamaica formally capitulated to the representatives of Cromwell, the Lord Protector of England, and as early as the following July 18th, we find a document signed by the field officers of the Army in Jamaica entitled, "Several considerations to be humbly represented to His Highness, the Lord Protector and Council concerning the Army in America, wherein after bespeaking necessary equipment and supplies, the request is made that servants from Scotland or elsewhere may be sent to assist in planting, etc., for which the officers out of their piety will make such allowance as His Highness shall think fit, and assign them such proportion of land as His Highness shall direct at the expiration of their respective terms. There is in the library at Boston College, Newton, Massachusetts, an undated manuscript, presumably in the handwriting of Oliver Cromwell, entitled Certain Queries Concerning His Highness' Interest in the West Indies. The last two paragraphs read as follows. 14. Whether His Highness' interest in the West Indies can be carried on without the settling of some course for the constant supplying them with people. And 15. Whether the weeding the commonwealth of vagabonds, condemned persons, and such as are useless and hurtful in war and peace, and a settled course taken for the transporting them to the Indies and thereby principally supplying Jamaica is not necessary to be consulted. It may have been in consequence of this memorandum that a letter was dispatched in the name of the Protector to his son Henry, who was Major General in command of the forces in Ireland. While the communication itself was no longer available, its purport is disclosed by the answer to Secretary Thurlow, which is dated September 11th, 1655. Sir, I received yours of the 4th instant, and give you many thanks for your relation of Jamaica. And though we have met with some more than ordinary cross providence in this undertaking, yet I doubt not but the Lord will smile upon it in the issue. I have endeavored to make what important I could in the short time allotted me touching the furnishing you with a recruit of men and a supply of young Irish girls. In order to it, I have advised with the chief officers near me, not having opportunity to make it more public. Apologize for the pages. Opportunity to make it public. Neither do I think it's convenient until I know your resolutions more particularly. Concerning the young women, although we must use force in taking them up, yet it being so much for their own good and likely to be of so great advantage to the public, it is not in the least doubted that you may have such number of them as you shall think fit to make us upon this account. A week later, we have the following from the same source. I have little to add to repeat anything about the girls, not doubting but to answer your expectations to the full, and I think it might be of like advantage to your affairs there and ours here, if you should think fit to send 1,500 or 2,000 young boys of 12 or 14 years of age to the place aforementioned. We could well spare them, and they will be of use to you, and who knows but that it may be a means to make them Englishmen. I mean, rather, Christians. Pause. So they were taking those Irish and Scottish brothers and sisters and sending them to the colonies, and part of them Christianizing them, they were making them English. Let's see. I gotta make this easier to be able to read. Okay. On September 25th, we have this reply from Thurlow in the name of the Protector. I return your lordship most humble thanks for the letter I received from you touching transporting of Irish girls to Jamaica, and thought that I might by this post have sent the particular encouragements which my Lord Protector and the Council will give for the better enabling your lordship and the Council of Ireland to have proceeded in that business, but I have been prevented therein by my bodily indisposition, and therefore by this can only desire your lordship to proceed as far as you can, till more particular advices can be sent. To this comes the assurance under the date of October 9th, 1655. As for the girls, you may be confident to have what you desire, in as short a time as you can expect. Here belongs an undated instruction for Thurlow to Henry Cromwell in Ireland. I did hope to have given your lordship an account by this post of the business of causing young wenches and youths in Ireland to be sent into the West Indies, but I could not make things ready. The committee of the council have voted 1,000 girls and as many youths to be taken up for that purpose, and that there be a sum of money for each head allowed for the clothing of them and other necessaries to the waterside. The answer is dated October 16th. Let me pull this out. October 16th. I understand by your last letter that the transportation of 1,000 girls and the like number of boys is resolved on by the, and sometimes I don't think you brothers and sisters can read that if I go out too far. So I just got to keep it like this. All right. That might make it work better. That may work better. Greeting, brothers McGarrell from the house of McGarrell. Glad you was able to make it, Noble. All right, so let me get back to where I'll start that. Okay, so it says, I understand by your last letter, that the transportation of 1,000 Irish girls and the like number of boys is resolved on by the council. We shall have upon the receipt of His Highness his pleasure the number you propound and more if you think fit. Further instructions were dispatched to Ireland about November 1st, 1655. The ships, which are next to go thither to the West Indies, will be appointed to take on board them the Irish women and girls. The time that they must be at port will be about the latter end of December. And Henry Cromwell replies on November 14th, as for the Irish girls, you need not doubt of them, neither as time or place. Finally, on Christmas Day 1655, Thurlow writes to Henry Cromwell in Ireland, we hear nothing from Jamaica, and whilst we do, we are at a stand as to sending anything thither. Only some ships are in preparation, and 2 are already gone with such things as we judge most necessary for their subsistence. Samuel Rawson Gardner in his History of the Commonwealth and Protectorate, while admitting the foregoing correspondence and quoting further an order in council of October 3rd that 1,000 boys, and 1,000 girls should be shipped at Galway in December. The age fixed in both cases being under 14 positively asserts, in the end, not a single Irish boy or girl was dispatched across the Atlantic in consequence of this resolution, and adds in the footnote, not only can no such transportation be traced in the records, either in London or Dublin, but there is the negative evidence of the absence of any mention of the arrival of so numerous a body by the writers of the voluminous letters while chronicled the position of affairs in Jamaica. So careful are the writers to tell everything that concerns the colony that it is incredible that they should have closed their eyes to such an importation if it had ever taken place. 1 second. Thank you, Noble. I'm glad you're here, engaging. This is the only way, we'll be able to break through the algorithm. So, having you here, like I said, helps tremendously. So, thank you. Had to wet my whistle, man. Reading that definitely gets you parched. All right, so let me see where I got. So, like I said, not only can leave it. So careful are the writers to tell everything that concerns the colony, that it is incredible that they should have closed their eyes to such an importation if it had ever taken place. In view of this flat denial, it behooves us to weigh carefully the evidence adduced from many sources. James Anthony Froude, who will never be accused of bias in favor of Catholic Ireland, after speaking of the enlistment of the Irish soldiers in foreign service, remarks, "The Catholic priests were more sharply dealt with. At first, such of them as did not move of their own accord were put on board vessels bound for Spain. This proving no deterrent, they were sent to the Barbados settlement. Finally, when the numbers arrested were too great to be so provided for, they were removed to two islands in the Atlantic, the Isle of Arran and the Enos Bofin, where cabins were built for them, and they were allowed 6 pence a day for their maintenance." In a footnote, he adds, "I cannot pass over this part of my narrative without making my acknowledgement to Mr. Pendergrass, to whose personal courtesy I am deeply indebted, and to whose impartiality and candor in his volume of the Cromwellian settlement I can offer no higher praise than by saying that the perusal of it has left on my mind, an impression." Greetings, Brother Magnus from the House of Magnus. I'm glad you was able to make it as well, Noble. However long you can, like I said, is good enough. I am deeply indebted, and to whose impartiality and candor in this volume of the Cromwellian settlement can I offer no higher praise than by saying that the perusal of it has left on my mind an impression precisely opposite to that of Mr. Pendergrass himself. He writes as an Irish patriot, I as an Englishman, but the difference between us is not on the facts, but on the opinion to be formed about them. All right, so this is an Irishman, or he writes, like you said, as an Irish patriot. So he's speaking in defense for the Irish, as he himself, though, is an Englishman, pretty much like how we are today, Englishmen. But we also recognize many of us actually having Irish blood based off of lineal descent, rather it come from our patrilineal or matrilineal side. It's still there, and so we have the ability to speak on everyone in this case, because we're trying to let you know we are all one. All right, so let's continue. We cannot then better begin the study of our knotty problem than by taking up the evidence adduced by John Pendergrass, whose impartiality and candor is thus established beyond question. Mr. Pendergrass' work, The Cromwellian Settlement in Ireland, appeared in London in 1865 in Appendix 11, which entitled Of the Seizing of Widows and Orphans and the Destitute and Transporting them to Barbados and the English Plantations. We read, while the government were employed in clearing the ground for the adventurers and soldiers, the English capitalists of that day, by making the nobility and gentry yield up their ancient inheritances and withdraw to Connaught or Connaught, where they could wish the whole nation, they had agents actively employed through Ireland, seizing women, orphans, and the destitute to be transported to Barbados and the English plantations in America. And hope you understand who the people they're talking about. It was a measure beneficial to Ireland, which was thus relieved of a population that might trouble the planters if it was a benefit to the people removed, who might thus be made English and Christians, and a great benefit to the West India sugar planters, who desired the men and boys for their bondmen, and the women and Irish girls in the country where they had only maroon women and negresses, to solace them. The 13 Years' War from 1641 to 1654, followed by the departure of 40,000 Irish soldiers with the chief nobility and gentry to Spain, had left behind a vast mass of widows and deserted wives with destitute families. There were plenty of other persons, too, who, as their ancient properties had been confiscated, had no visible means of livelihood. Just as the King of Spain sent over his agents to treat with the government for the Irish swordsmen, the merchants of Bristol had agents treating with it for men, women, and girls to be sent to the sugar plantations in the West Indies. The commissioners for Ireland gave them orders upon the governors of garrisons to deliver them the prisoners of war upon the keepers of Gauls or Gauls for offenders in custody, upon masters of workhorses for the destitute in their care, who were of an age to labor, or if women were marriageable and not past breeding, and gave directions to all in authority to seize those who had no visible means of livelihood and deliver them to these agents of the Bristol sugar merchants, in execution of which latter direction Ireland must have exhibited scenes in every part like the slave hunts. Come on. Sorry about this. I'm gonna act up when I'm trying to read. Always doesn't fail. All right, excuse me. So I have exhibited. Come on, what's going on? All right, so it said direction. Ireland must have exhibited scenes in every part. Come on, what is going on? Like the slave hunts of Africa, how many girls of gentle birth must have been caught and hurried to the private prisons of these men catchers? None can tell. But at the last, the evil became too shocking and notorious, particularly when these dealers in Irish flesh began to seize the daughters and children of the English themselves and to force them on board their slave ships. Then indeed the orders at the end of 4 years were revoked. Pause. So it's saying that the slave catchers who were taking the Irish girls and boys eventually start turning on the English and start capturing the English children as well and sending them over to the colonies as well as to the islands, or what they call the West Indies Islands. In January 1654, the governors of Carlisle, Kilkenny, Clonmel, Wexford, Ross, and Waterford had orders to arrest and deliver to Captain Thomas Morgan, Dudley North, and John Johnson, English merchants, all wanderers, men and women, and such other Irish within their precincts as should not prove they had such a settled course of industry as yielded them a means of their own to maintain them. All such children as were in hospitals or workhouses, all prisoners, men and women, to be transported to the West Indies. So they're also saying that those of you who didn't have jobs, if you were just idle, they was wrapping you or they was wrangling you up and they were sending you to the colonies. The governors were to guard the prisoners to the ports of shipping, but the prisoners were to be provided for and maintained by and the said contractors and none to be discharged except by the order under the hand and seal of the governor ordering the arrest. It is easy to imagine the deeds done under such a power. On the 22nd of December of the same year, orders were issued prohibiting all the shipping in any harbor in Ireland bound for the Barbados and other English plantations from weighing anchor until searched in order that any persons found to have been seized without warrant should be delivered. All right, so they pretty much make sure that they weren't just so-called randomly capturing folks who didn't actually have a true warrant or bounty. All measures, however, were vain to prevent the most cruel captures as long as these English slave dealers had a recourse to Ireland. In the course of four years, they had seized and shipped about 6,400 Irish men and women, boys and maidens, when on the 4th of March, 1655, all orders were revoked. These men catchers employed persons, so runs the order, to delude poor people by false pretenses into by places, and thence they forced them on board their ships. The persons employed had so much a piece for all so deluded, and for the money's sake, they were found to have enticed and forced women from their children and husbands, children from their parents, who maintained them at school, and they not only dealt so with the Irish, but also with the English. Excuse me. Which last was the true cause, probably, of the commissioners for Ireland putting an end to these proceedings. This point will recur later. Prendergast continues, yet not quite an end. In 1655, Admiral Penn added Jamaica to the Empire of England. All right, so England or Jamaica became part of the Empire of England in 1655. And colonists being wanted, the Lord Protector applied to the Lord Henry Cromwell, then Major General of the forces in Ireland, to engage 1,500 of the soldiers of the army in Ireland to go thither as planters and to secure 1,000 young Irish girls. Irish wenches is Secretary Thurlow's term. To be sent there also. Henry Cromwell answered that there will be no difficulty, only that force must be used in taking them. And he suggested the addition of from 1,500 to 2,000 boys and from 12 to 14 years of age. We could well spare them, he adds, and they might be of use to you, and who knows, but it might be means to make them Christians. The numbers finally fixed were 1,000 boys and 1,000 girls to sail Galway in October 1655. The boys as bondsmen, probably, and the girls to be bound by others ties to these English soldiers in Jamaica. A specific instance cited by Prendergast is the following. Daniel Connery, a gentleman of Clare, was sentenced in the Morrison presence to banishment in 1657 by Colonel Henry Inglesby for harboring a priest. This gentleman was a wife and 12 children. Or this gentleman has a wife and 12 children. Wow. His wife fell sick and died in poverty. 3 of his daughters were beautiful girls. They were transported to the West Indies to an island called the Barbados. And there, if they are alive, they are in miserable slavery. As regards priests in particular, Prendergast records, in consequence of the great increase of priests towards the close of the year 1655, a general arrest by the justices of the peace was ordered, under which in April 1655, the prisons in every part of Ireland seem to have been filled to overflowing. On the 3rd of May, the governor, on the 3rd of May, the governors of the respective precincts were ordered to send them with sufficient guards to Carrickfergus to be there, or to be there, put on board such ship as should sail with the first opportunity for the Barbados. One may imagine the pains of this toilsome journey by the petition of one of them, Paul Cahan, an aged priest apprehended at Maryborough and sent to Phillipstown on a way to Carrickfergus. There fell desperately sick, and being also extremely aged, was in danger of perishing in restraint for want of friends and means of relief. On the 27th of August, 1656, the commissioners, having ascertained the truth of his petition, they ordered him 6 pence a day during his sickness, and in answer probably to this poor prisoner's prayer to be spared from transportation, their order directed that it should be continued to him in his travel thence after his recovery to Carrickfergus, in order to his transportation to the Barbados. At Carrickfergus, Colonel Cooper, who was in charge of the prison, was authorized to dispense with transportation in the case of those who would renounce the Pope's supremacy and frequent the Protestant meetings and no other. If further legal evidence was required, we have it among the acts of the Second Parliament of the Protectorate under date of June 26, 1657, where we find an act for the attainder of the rebels in Ireland, wherein it is provided that those who fail to transplant themselves into Connaught or declare within 6 months of the publication of the act in Ireland shall be attainted of high treason, and after conviction are to be sent to America or some other parts beyond the seas, in pursuance of the said sentence of banishment, which the said Lord Deputy and Council, or the Chief Governor or Governors for the time being, are hereby authorized and required to put in execution accordingly. So, for a move further, as we can see that there was people who were getting not only wrangled up by the slave catchers, but there was also those who were getting ordered banishment indictments in this case, and were getting sent out of the island to be sent to the territories that we call the British American colonies today. All right. All right, so it says, so thus those banished who returned into any part of the Commonwealth of England, Scotland, and Ireland without license under the Great Seal of England are to suffer the pains of death as felons by virtue of this act without the benefit of clergy. So we couldn't return. Samuel Rawson Gardner, who so emphatically denies the Cromwellian shipment of Irish girls to Jamaica, in speaking of the capture of the Drogheda, September 12, 1649, unreservedly admits when the inevitable surrender came, Cromwell, instead of directing a promiscuous slaughter, ordered that the officers should be knocked on the head and every 10th man of the soldiers shipped for the Barbados, whilst the whole garrison of the other tower was spared, though they too were sent to Barbados. A further admission by the same author is worth recording. Prisoners and others sent to Barbados or elsewhere in America are frequently spoken of as having been sent into slavery. If the word is used rhetorically, it may be true enough. The petition of Marcellus Rivers and Oxenbridge Foyle, after their return to England in 1659, they having been among the prisoners charged with participation in Penruddock's rising and transported later in the year to Barbados, shows their condition, even if the allowance is made for exaggeration to have been deplorable enough. Being sadly arrived at Barbados, they say, the master of the ship sold your miserable petitioners and the others, the generality of them, to most inhuman and barbarous persons, for 1,500 pounds weight of sugar apiece, as the goods and the chattels of Martin Noel and Major Thomas Alderney of London and Captain, excuse me, excuse me, Thomas Audern of London and Captain Henry Hatsell of Plymouth, neither sparing the age of 80 years old, nor divines, nor officers, nor gentlemen, nor any age or condition of men. It is, however, certainly not the case. Certainly not the case that these men were condemned to a lifelong servitude, though they were not allowed, after their time of service had expired, to leave the island. The custom of all merchants trading thither, writes F. Barrington, who visited Barbados in 1655, is to bring as many men and women as they can. No sooner doth a ship come to an anchor, but presently the islanders go aboard her, inquiring what servants they can buy. If they are above 17 years of age, they serve but 4 years, according to the law of the island. But if under 17, then left to the discretion of the merchant as he can agree with the planter. These servants planteth, weedeth, and manureth their ground by all by hand. The freemen are such who served in the country for their freedom or pay their passage when transported from England. While it is theoretically true that the indentured labor or bondsman in the West Indies might not be classed as slavery, we must not lose sight of what Lagan records from his own observations in Barbados at the very period when the Irish exiles were being delivered there. The island is divided into 3 sorts of men, viz., masters, servants, and slaves. The slaves and their posterity, being subject to their masters forever, are kept and preserved with greater care than the servants, who are theirs but for 5 years according to the law of the island, so that for the time the servants have the worser lives, for they are put to very hard labor, ill lodging, and their diet very slight. Moreover, Cromwell wrote to Daniel Cyril, governor of Barbados, on August 23rd, 1655, complaining that some of the unfortunates had been allowed to leave the island when the term of their indenture was ended. This brought from the governor a protest of loyalty and a further assurance, for the future, such as your highness shall please to command to stay here, I shall, to the utmost possibility of means to be used, labor to keep them with us in pursuance of your highness commands. Pause. So even after the indentures were over, for those who was considered free after the contract, they were not allowed to actually leave the island. So if they wanted to go back home to Ireland, England, or Scotland, because of what the Enterprise were doing at this moment, by trying to people them up with as many people as possible, they weren't allowing anybody, even after the completion of their indenture, to return home. So they made them stay there and make the island, in this case the West Indies or the Americas, their home. Robert Dunlop, in his preface to Ireland under the Commonwealth, tells us the documents printed in these 2 volumes form part of a collection I made many years ago when I had it in mind to write a history of the Commonwealth in Ireland. At the time, I was of opinion that the view taken by Prendergast in his well-known book, The Cromwellian Settlement in Ireland, was not an entirely impartial one. I thought it possible to present the Cromwellian policy in a more favorable light than either he or Carte, with his loyalist predilections. I gotta get this to work. His loyalist predilections had done. My position was taken up by Cromwell himself, viz. That the conquest and confiscation of Ireland was a divine retribution for the horrid and unprovoked massacre by the Irish Catholics of the English and Scottish settlers in Ireland in the first year of the rebellion. In this spirit, I made these transcripts, and nothing that I read in them tended to alter that view. Subsequent studies, however, entirely disabused the author which fact detracts nothing from the real value of the documentary evidence which he furnishes for our present purpose. The author cites such a mass of well authenticated facts that we can only touch on a few of the more pertinent and startling documents, leaving it to the interested reader to consult Dunlop direct. January 30th, 1654, Oliver Cromwell writes to Fleetwood, Lord Deputy of Ireland, some merchants of the city of Bristol having petitioned to me for license to transport 400 of the Irish Tories and such other idle and vagrant persons as may be thought fittest to be spared out of Ireland for planting of the Caribbean islands, which address of theirs I do recommend to your consideration, that their desire therein may be granted in such a way as to you shall seem fit and expedient. November 4th, 1653, Colonel Edmund O. Dower is permitted by the Commissioners of Parliament for the Affairs of Ireland to transport such priests, Jesuits, and other persons in popish orders who are still in Ireland. April 19th, 1654, ordered that all vagabonds in the precincts of Limerick and Cork be apprehended and delivered to Captain John Norris or his agent to be transported to the Caribbean islands. June 15th, 1654, the commissioners instruct Colonel Fair in connection with the O'Dower permit, and in case you find that the men raised upon O'Dower account do not amount to the number 400, which number the merchants are to have delivered to them, then you are to supply that number by causing to be apprehended vagrants and idle persons who can give no good account of their living, nor have friends nor means to maintain them. Pause. So, like I was saying before, they decided to get rid of all of the so-called vagrants, aka folks who had no place to live, had no means, had no job. They were just idle. So if you just had idle time or weren't doing anything productive and didn't have proof of what you were doing and where you stayed or what you call home, they were wrangling you up and they were sending you to the colonies. June 26, 1654, ordered that Colonel Stubbers be authorized to transport out of Connaught for the West Indies 80 Irish women that are vagrants, idlers, and wanderers. So these are Irish women. Remember, these are melanated women, like I said, black Irish. So these are Irish women who they consider vagrants, idlers. They weren't doing anything, and wanderers. They just wander around. They just wrangling them up and getting them up out of there. So history repeats itself, brothers and sisters. You can't be idle. You can't just be what they consider vagrant. You can't just be loitering, things of that nature. You have to have a purpose. You have to be doing something in society that was recognized for you to not to have to be considered all right, so my camera went out. For you not to be considered an outcast, or for them not to outcast you. All right, so let me get this back on up here real quick. Once this might be easier now that the camera is actually off, to be able to read it for you. One second. And don't forget, brothers and sisters, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. For those of you who just now hearing it for the first time, even if this is something you don't care for, still hit that like button, because that's going to help me, whether you know it or not, to get through the algorithm. More engagement, the better. Second. It's hot out here. It is hot out here. Okay. All right, bam. There we go. All right, so hopefully that's easier for you brothers and sisters to be able to see. Apologize, my camera went off. Next time I make sure that it's charged up and fully ready to go. All right, so we continue. It says, June 26, 1654, ordered that Colonel Stubbers be authorized to transport out of Connaught for the West Indies 60 Irish women that are vagrants, idlers, and wanderers. January 26, 1655, ordered that such Catholic priests in custody in Dublin as are not found guilty of murder be transported to Barbados. November 19th, 1655, among the instructions for Sir C. Coote, President of Connaught, or the Governor of Galway, for the time being, the said governor to take care that the priests, and likewise to give public notice that in any case any of the said priests, hold on, give me 1 second. Priests, friars shall at any time return to this nation without any special license, that they shall be proceeded against according to the laws now in force. December 4th, 1655, it is ordered that certain persons, certain prisoners, some of them priests, and 20 women be delivered to Captain Norris, merchant, to be transported to Barbados, and on December 18th, in connection with the consignment, Herbert sends instructions to the governor of Barbados. Daniel Cyril, His Highness Counsel for the Affairs of Ireland, have ordered Captain John Norris to take aboard his ship divers, Irishmen and women, such as by the justices of peace are found to be vagabonds and idlers, to be exported to the Barbados or some other of the English plantation islands of the Caribbees or thereabouts, and also their popish priests who are likewise to be there landed. It is the desire of the council that care may be taken in special concerning those 3 priests, that they may be so employed as they may not be at liberty to return again into this nation, where that sort of people are able to do much mischief by having so great an influence over the popish Irish here, and of alienating their affections from the present government. Second. July 29th, 1656, it is ordered in connection with divers Irish Papists now in prison in the county Galls and sundry places of Leinster and Munster, that such of them as shall upon due proof appear to be loose and dangerous persons, be by the governor there speedily put on board the vessel now riding in the harbor of Kinsale and bound for the Caribbean islands, or otherwise secure them until the said ship shall be ready to receive them on board. March 4th, 1657, we find the confession of the abuses that had prevailed in this traffic in human beings in the orders. The council, having received many complaints of the abuse of some orders, formerly granted to several persons to carry away idle and vagabond persons to the West Indies, who instead of pursuing the direction of those orders, by having a warrant from some of the justices of the peace of the county where such persons were taken up, employ persons to delude and deceive poor people by false pretenses, either by getting them aboard the ships or in other by places into their power, and forcing them away. The persons so employed having so much apiece for all, they so delude and for the money's sake have enticed and forced women from their children and husbands, and children from their parents, who maintained them at school, and they had not only dealt so with the Irish, but also the English, do think fit in orders that all orders granted to any person whatsoever being not in force to take up and carry idle and vagabond persons as aforesaid be henceforth made null and void, and they refer it to the care of the justices of the peace in the several counties and to the governors of the several precincts and garrisons in this nation, that the execution of all such orders be for the future forborne, leaving the dispose and prosecution against such idle persons to be according to the usual proceedings of justice, that the abuse complained of was in reality the inclusion of English with the Irish seizures, which, as we have seen in Prendergast's assertion, is substantiated by the future action of the council. For, to cite only a single instance, on October 26, 1658, we find the Lord Deputy and Council pleased to pardon sundry persons, to have them shipped to the number of about 100 to the Barbados, where they are to be delivered to merchants who are to have to dispose of them, except the number often who will be speedily designed to a person inhabiting the Barbados. As must have been noticed in the foregoing citations, priests were singled out for the particular attention. As early as June 10, 1653, we find an order by the commissioners of the Commonwealth of the Affairs of Ireland, whereby priests or other persons in popish orders were to repair to the waterside for the transportation overseas, which concludes, and it is further ordered that such of the said persons and all other priests and others in popish orders as shall not come in and render themselves as above said, be apprehended and proceeded against according to former declarations published in their behalf. Let us turn now to still another witness whose testimony cannot be controverted. Sir William Petty, styled by Gardner, a man of varied ability, who, as a physician general of the army in Ireland, had effected a series of far-reaching reforms, says of himself, somewhat naively, I was secretary to the Lord Lieutenant Henry Cromwell, and esteemed his favorite, was envied for my frequent privacies with him. And again, my experience arising from the management of the survey brought me to be one of the commissioners for the setting out lands to the army. That employment to be one of the clerks of the council. All these employments together gave me the opportunity to let the Lord Deputy see I was, in a time of great scarcity, able to serve him as secretary. According to Burton's diary, Dr. Petty was accused before Parliament of bribery, dishonesty, etc., and being brought to trial was ultimately removed from public employment, but to the end retained the friendship of Henry Cromwell, who had no doubt benefited by his manipulations of the survey. In view of all of this, we must give great weight to his words when, after stating about 500 to 4,000 of the Irish perished and were wasted by the sword, plague, famine, hardship, and banishment between the 23rd of October 1641 and the same day 1652, he records that besides soldiers there were transported of boys, women, priests, etc., no less than 6,000 more, whereof not half are returned. Brother McGirl, you said any demographics on Cromwell? Yeah, Oliver Cromwell was melanated. This is a melanated brother. So for those of you who are unaware of the Cromwells, especially during this era, he was what we call, for lack of a better term, he was considered what we call a black man. All right. So what was going on in the British Isles when it comes down to the transatlantic slave trade that actually was happening or taking place in Great Britain before they so-called went to the so-called territory of Africa, it was happening amongst us. It was happening between the English the Irish as well as the Scottish at war with each other, and were sending each other based off of the merchants to the islands that we call the Caribbeans, as well the British American colonies we call with the mainland. And based off of the rules at that time, regulation, even those of us who were free or paid the way of for freedom during that time, you couldn't return back to the British Isles. You couldn't return back. So yes, it sucks to say it, but this is who it was. All right, so let's go ahead and continue. Petty further states, it follows that 167,000 died in 11 years by the sword and famine and other hardships, which I think not incredible for supposing half the number, these 87,000 died in 11 years of famine and cold and transportation to Spain and Barbados. It is not hard to believe that the other 87,000 perished by the sword. It should be noted too that Petty confines himself to the 11 years ending October 23rd, 1652, while most of our records of transportation to the Barbados and other West India islands are subsequent to that date. This part of our subject we may bring to a close by a quotation from George Robert Wayne, an Anglican minister, archdeacon of Agdo and canon of St. Patrick's Cathedral, Dublin, who can scarcely be accused of partiality towards suffering papists. In his sixth Donnellan lecture, delivered before the University of Dublin in the spring of 1901, he says, "The victories of Cromwell in the English and Irish wars of the Long Parliament furnished thousands of white slaves to till the fertile Jamaican valleys, and selfish greed, constant quarreling between rival grantees, and a low type of morality long arrested, and development of Barbados. The Cromwellian settlement in Ireland has been described in bitter terms by Mr. Pendergrass. Amongst all the hard things done in those days, none were more severe than the wholesale deportation of children to the West Indies." So you got back 24% West African, 8% England, 4% Northwestern Europe. Now remember too, the history of those folks who they sent to West Africa, like in a territory they call Liberia, all of that. Those were originally people who came from America, who were originally truly descendants of the British Isles. That's how they were able to set that colony up so well over there, because of that information folks don't know about. But it's the truth. Chapter 2, through Barbados. So unquestionably, from the very beginning of Cromwellian rule, the British West Indies in general, but Barbados in particular, had literally become the land of bondage for great numbers of the Irish of both sexes. It gives a chance visitor matter for serious thought to find among the monumental inscriptions at the Protestant Cathedral, Bridgetown, Barbados, such names as the following: Michael Cavan, 6 Collins, 2 Colonial, James Connolly, Henry Cumming, 12 Cummins, 4 Donovan, Jane Duffy, Margaret Ann Dunn, 2 Farley, Daniel and Jane Grogan, 5 King, 3 Kelly, 11 Lynch, 2 McCabe, Robert McCann, 2 McDermott, Catherine, Mary, and John McSwiney, 4 Mority, 5 O'Brien, 2 O'Halloran, Daniel O'Keefe, 4 O'Neill, John Prendergast, John Tierney, and 4 Welsh. Richard Blome, writing as early as 1678, tells us concerning Barbados, the inhabitants of the of this isle may be ranged under three heads or sorts, to wit, masters, which are English, Scotch, and Irish, with some few Dutch, French, and Jews, Christian servants, and Negro slaves. And these three sorts are exceeding numerous, for according to a calculation not long since made, the masters and servants did amount to about 50,000, and the Negroes to about double the number. The figures are probably exaggerated, as Blome is writing from hearsay and not from personal observation. Thomas Warner secured from Charles I on September 13, 1625, a commission as governor of the English islands and the Caribbean Sea, of which Barbados and St. Christopher were for a time to be the principal ones. The latter had been settled by Warner some 18 months previously, and a crew of a French privateer, which had fared ill in an encounter with a Spanish galleon, had shortly after joined in the venture. While the English and French segregated themselves, the French at the ends of the island and the English in the middle, for the time being, they formed an alliance against the common enemy, the Caribbean Indians. Possibly the nearness of their Catholic neighbors, the French may explain why St. Christopher became almost from the start a rendezvous for the Irish, notably on the part of the bondsmen at the end of their servitude on the other island. They were thus enabled to practice their religion again, for as Caesar de Rochefort mentions in 1646, the Capuchins were replaced by the Jesuits and the Carmelites in charge of the French settlers on St. Christopher. He then adds, Father Henry du Vivier, or Vivier, was the first superior of the house of the Jesuits. His sweetness and kindly conversation has won for him the heart of all those of our nation who dwell on this island. Edmund Bohun in 1693 records that prior to the English seizure of the French part of St. Christopher in the summer of 1690, there was in the French town of Bastere a Jesuit college. But this word college may be due to a faulty translation of the French mason, as Davies in his English translation of de Rochefort, which appeared in London in 1666, and on which Bohun probably relied, so rendered it. Frank Wesley Pittman asserts that as late as 1722, St. Christopher had a militia of 1,100 and remarks, all the most wealthy and best educated of St. Christopher resided in England. The rest were mainly Irish Catholics disaffected to English government. The middle of the 17th century, Williamson says, at St. Christopher, pressure of population kept alive the ill feeling between French and English, which was to lead to the catastrophe of 1666. But for the present, an uneasy peace was maintained. The Irish element was a danger to English power. In 1650, a Jesuit priest was sent out by his order to carry on work among his co-religionists. He built a chapel just inside the French boundary at Sandy Point and attracted crowds of Irish servants over the border. After staying 3 months and making 3,000 parishioners, he went in disguise to Montserrat and conducted a similar mission there. Later, he attempted to resume his work at St. Christopher. The English authorities bestirred themselves and forbade the Irish to cross the border. A great deal of sedition resulted, and the Jesuit finally removed to Guadeloupe in 1653. The priest referred to was the Reverend John Stritch, S.J., a native of Limerick in Ireland, who labored for a time in the West Indies. But Williamson is in error, and assuming that Father Stritch was alone on St. Christopher. As we have seen, he found there a regularly established Jesuit community with Father Duvivier as superior. What does seem probable is that Father Stritch was the first Irish Jesuit to visit his countrymen in their land of bondage. His welcome must naturally have attracted the attention of the English authorities, but that as may, when Father Stritch reached the island of Montserrat, despite the fact that it was under English rule, he found there was for all practical purposes an Irish Catholic settlement. In 1678, Richard Blome wrote of Montserrat, this isle is most inhabited by the Irish, who have here a church for divine worship. And Brian Edwards, the historian of West Indies, states more in detail that Montserrat was first planted by a small colony from St. Christopher, detached in 1632 from the adventures under Warner. Their separation appears indeed to have been partly occasioned by local attachments and religious decisions, which rendered their situation in St. Christopher uneasy, being chiefly natives of Ireland of the Romish persuasion. The same causes, however, operated to the augmentation of their excuse me. All right, the same causes, however, operated to the augmentation of their numbers, for so many persons of the same country and religion adventured thither soon after the first settlement, as to create a white population which has never since possessed, if it be true, as asserted by old Mixon, that at the end of 15 years there were in the island upwards of 1,000 white families, constituting a militia of 360 effective men. At Barbados, too, the percentage of Irish in the population was high, but here they were for the most part of the bondsmen or servant class. In 1657, Legan gives us a map with the masters' names of the several planticons, and there are but few Irish names in evidence. We find Butler, Hales, and 3 Tyrrells, also a Patrick and Cornelius, and nearby the latter an Irishman, probably for Irishman, as elsewhere we have Price and Price's men, similarly located. Besides, there are several other names that might be either Irish or Scotch. In the 1673 edition of Legan's history, this particular map has been replaced by one by Brian Edwards, taken from his History of the West Indies. Most of the names noted on the former map have disappeared, but we find Barry, Dolan, Mullins, perhaps for Mullins, 1 Tyrrell, and 1 Tyrrell with an I. In any case, we are safe in concluding that in Legan's day, the Irish population of Barbados was still for the most part restricted to the servant class, and their lot was a hard one in the extreme. In fact, Legan makes it clear that the life of the bondsman was in reality more unbearable than that of even the Negro slaves. Wow. For after stating that at the first advent to the island, which was in September 1647, some of the planters ate bone meat only twice a week, but the servants no bone meat at all, unless an ox died, and then they were feasted as long as that lasted. He further observes, upon the arrival of any ship that brings servants to the island, the planters go aboard, and having bought such of them as they like, send them with a guide to his plantation, and being come, commands them instantly to make their cabins, which they not knowing how to do, are to be advised by other of their servants, that are the seniors. But if they be churlish and will not show them, or if materials are wanting to make them cabins, then they are to lie on the ground that night. These cabins are to be made of sticks, withes, and plantain leaves, under some little shade that may keep the rain off. Their suppers being a few potatoes for meat, and water or mabi for drink. Their working hours are 6 to 11, and 6 in the morning to 11. 6 in the morning to 11 in the morning, and 1 in the afternoon to 6 in the evening, with a severe overseer to command them. Shirt and drawers or short and draws are their only garments, and if it's a chance to rain and wet them through, they have no shift, but must lie so all night. If they put off their clothes, the cold of the night will strike into them, And if they be not strong, this ill lodging will put them into a sickness. If they complain, they are beaten by the overseer. If they resist, their time is doubled. I have seen an overseer beat a servant with a cane about the head till the blood has followed, for a fault that is not worth the speaking of, and yet he must have patience, or worse will follow. This is sad, brothers and sisters. This is literally what was going on, what we were doing to each other. Truly, I have seen such cruelty there done to servants, and I did not think one Christian could have done to another. Yeah, these were folks who were calling themselves Christians too, by the way. Referring to this account of Ligon's, Pittman observes, he admitted entirely any consideration of their adaptability for tropical field labor. A consideration that must be kept in mind when we try to form some concept of the sufferings of the expatriated in Barbados. In the Davis collection, which consisted of transcripts, are Barbadian documents by N. Darnell Davis, and which was the property of the Royal Colonial Institute, London, was included a planter's will dated May 1st, 1657, in which it was set forth, I give to my Christian servants, Desmond O'Doyle and Hannah, 6 months a piece of their times, provided that they do continue dutiful servants to my wife. But if they be anyways disobedient or refractory, then this bequest to be void and of none effect. And unto Desmond O'Doyle I give my best suit of clothes and my best hat. Harlow, quoting this document, admits that this is an exception to the general rule of severity that existed in the treatment of white labor in Barbados, which he says was generally a disgrace to the English name. Griffith Hughes, in his very name, is suggested despite the fact that he was a rector of St. Lucy's Anglican Church in Barbados. Writing in 1750 tells us concerning their Negro slaves, even in his day, we are obliged, in order to keep up a necessary number, to have a yearly supply from Africa. The hard labor and often the wants of necessaries which these unhappy creatures are obliged to undergo destroy a greater number than are bred here. If this was true of the Negro, inured he was to hardship and privations, what must have been the mortality among the white indentured servants, who were frequently of gentle origin, and whose lot in bondage was far more arduous and exhausting than that of the Negro slaves. Such then was the fate of the Irish victims of the Cromwellian brutality, whether we wish to call them slaves or designate them by the more euphemistic name of bond servants. Before leaving Barbados, however, attention pretty much, Noble, yes. So they, like you said, so the slaves, or we're going to say the servants, because the servants, they were the ones who couldn't afford to eat meat. The slaves were the ones that they wanted to keep healthy, to continue to keep doing the work. The servants themselves weren't underneath the same type of contracts per se. So like even a lot of those who had paid their way for freedom, it was hard for them to afford to take care of themselves, which meant that they pretty much went without compared to those who were actually slaves, where they made sure, because slaves were considered property, they made sure that they paid the maintenance upkeep for their property. And we're not going to say they did this all the time, but based off of what was going on in these situations, they put more emphasis on what was theirs compared to what was not theirs. Once you freed yourself, they didn't care what you ate. They didn't care how you take care of yourself. They not really making money off of you per se compared to their property, which they need to make sure that they are fit to continue to keep working for them. Hopefully that makes sense. Let's see what I missed that. All right, it says it should be called to a statement of Ligan, who says in connection with his departure from the island that he left there April 15th, 1650 at midnight, which time our master made choice of that he might the better pass undescribed by a well-known pirate that had for many days lain hovering about the island to take any ships that traded with London by virtue of a commission, as he pretended from the marks of Ormond. This pirate was an Irishman. His name was Plunkett, a man bold enough, but had the character of being more merciless and cruel, then became a valiant man. A careful search of all available literature on piracy fails to disclose any rover of the sea by that name. Even Philip Goss in The Pirates Who's Who, London, 1924, after gathering his material from every possible source and listing even those whose names have been handed down to us in the desultory way, does not so much as mention anyone whose name is at all suggestive of Plunkett, while not denying the presence of Irishmen among the early buccaneers. In the present instance, Ligan's Irish pirate was in all probability, if not a figment of the imagination, at least a case of mistaken identity. All right, now chapter 3, to Jamaica. In concluding our chapter on the Irish and Barbados, we had occasion to refer in passing to buccaneers. It is interesting then to find Agnes M. Winston opening her foreword to the constitutional development of Jamaica with the observation, the conquest of Jamaica was the first of the great buccaneering expeditions. In the time of peace between England and Spain, Cromwell secretly prepared a naval and military force and sent it out to gain an interest in that part of the West Indies in the possession of the Spaniard. From the original manuscript in the Boston College Library, we find Admiral Penn reporting from Barbados under date of March 17th, 1655, in connection with the land forces, our new levies. And on the right hand side, we have some images of the children of the Collins family, the O'Hare, McCormick, and Kennedy. You're absolutely right, Brother McGarrell. Like I said, slaves were property, the servants were under contracts, agreements, willing, unwilling, former slaves, etc. Absolutely. And remember, not everyone who came over were underneath those indentures. Some came, like you said, did come willingly, and it was their choice. All right. And then the bottom, we have standing, like they said, the Collins, Walsh, McKeon, McDermott, then kneeling Burke and Mackey. So these are all Irish children, brothers and sisters, which they called in Jamaica the Black Irish, which many of their descendants are still alive today, because this book was written back in was published back in the 30s. So I'm quite sure that a lot of their descendants are around, not just on the island, but also here too in America, which we call the British American colonies. All right, let me see. All right, so levies whose number besides 2 troops of horse, I suppose, are above 3,000, and C.H. Firth, who edited the narrative of General Venables, who was the co-leader of the expedition with Admiral Penn, says, At Barbados, between 3,000 and 4,000 men were raised, of whom Lieutenant Colonel Barrington gives the following account: being well settled in our respective quarters, we had command given us to entertain all men that were willing to engage in the present expedition. Accordingly, we obeyed, but the inhabitants, finding themselves much grieved, and not without cause, they complained that they should be utterly ruined in case their servants were taken from them, they being their livelihood. Upon this complaint, our grandees, the commissioners, ordered that no officer whatsoever, upon pain of loss of place, shall detain any man's servant that had above 9 months to serve, and for the future to entertain none other but freemen, and such servants as came within the aforementioned limitation, all which was done intentionally to complete every regiment up to 1,000 before we marched from the island. The doing this hath much injured poor people, even to their undoing, and prejudiced many of the rich, some losing 10 servants, some 15, and some more, some less, none escaping us. After the disastrous repulse at San Domingo in April 1655, the expedition turned next to Jamaica, which was in no position to make even a feeble resistance. Ecclesiastical records for 1649 show that Santiago de la Vega, the only town of importance on the island, numbered less than 500 Spanish citizens. General Venable himself admits that even among the troops sent out with him from England were diverse Papists, in particular 16, and 4 of them Irish, and 1 priest in particular sent out of the Tower Regiment. Many more were found since, though all could discover were cashiered at Barbados. The general, however, is writing his defense for Cromwell, and he tends both to exaggerate his zealous cashiering of the Papists, even as he minimizes their number. For Isaac Birkenhead, Scoutmaster General of the expedition at the start, and later commissioned Adjutant General, had already reported to Secretary Thurlow, from Barbados, under date of February 17th, we have lately found the devil's endeavors to have his chapel amongst us, which we shall tear up by the roots. For I have made a discovery of certain Papists in our army, to the number of 150, which came out of England, and most of the regiments which came out of the Tower, which were raised in haste and put into Colonel's butlers. Besides, there are certain Irish Papists which were listed in the island since our coming, which we are now purging ourselves of. In Colonel Butler's regiment there have been divers quarrels amongst the officers, though taken up by the colonel. Their affections are various, and at disaffection generally, which makes me think of the number of Papists in his regiment, that they may work this disaffection. One of the recruits secured at Barbados, a large percentage regardless of religion, must have been Irish or Scotch, since they actually constituted the bulk of the servant class in the island, and we have here the first influx of Irish to Jamaica. More or less numerous parties must have followed. Soon after, for Harlow unhesitatingly records the development of Jamaica, on which Cromwell has set his heart, was being affected largely at the expense of Barbados and the Leeward Islands. On the 8th of October 1656, Governor Cyril received instructions from the Protector to encourage immigration to Jamaica as much as possible. For this purpose, he was desired to publish in the island an order declaring Jamaican goods free of custom and excise for 7 years. When then we find Major Robert Sedgwick, who reached Jamaica on October 1st, 1655, and who immediately assumed charge as commissioner, reporting that the soldiers left there had been principally drawn from the island of Barbados. We are forced to conclude that a really considerable number of Irish-born, or at least of Irish descent, must have found their way to Jamaica among the earliest settlers under Cromwell. This view is strengthened by what John Poyer writes about Jamaica. The conquest of that island, while it opened a wider field for speculation and the exercise of industry, served to drain the population of Barbados in no inconsiderable degree. Allured by the prospects of greater advantages in a theater so much more extensive, many opulent planters and other adventurers removed to Jamaica, where land could be procured in greater plenty, cheaper, and with less difficulty. At the start, the Irish population in Jamaica must have been pretty well restricted to the poorer class, as we find but few suggestive names among the principal planters and settlers in Jamaica in 1663, 8 years after the advent of the English to the island. This list has been preserved for us by Charles Long, whose father Samuel accompanied the original expedition of Penn and Venables as secretary to Cromwell's commission. Thus, we find in St. John's Pierce, who may be Irish, in St. Andrew's Bury, in St. Thomas in East, Kelly, in St. Mary's Boron, Lynch and Sutton, in Clarendon another Sutton, in Vere King, in St. Anne's Moore and Rowe, and in St. Elizabeth's a second Lynch, and even some of these are rather doubtful. But 7 years later, when no doubt many bond servants had worked out their indenture, the array of seemingly Irish names has increased remarkably in the report of September 23, 1670, made by Sir Thomas Modiford to Lord Arlington, giving a survey of the various parishes in the island as furnished by the Receiver General. Of the 717 property holders listed, the indications are that well over 10% were of Irish extraction, and as we might naturally expect to find a great bulk of the Irish among the non-owners of land at that early date, we may justly argue that even independent of the servant class, the Irish formed a large proportion of Jamaican population at the time. Of the bondsmen, Gardner writes that few ships arrived from England without some of this class on board, and they were for the most part Irish. We may judge from the following statement of Arthur Granville Bradley. Quote, Jamaica was for some time in a disturbed condition. The Maroons in their mountain fastnesses were a constant danger. The British military settlers required a firm hand, while the Catholic Irish prisoners, the unfortunate product of Irish wars, shipped in batches to the West Indies, were not in a mood to exercise their franchise in a manner conducive to the peace and loyalty of a British colony. Indeed, these drafts may be debited to the wrong side of Cromwell's account in a matter of the statesmanship. Idlers and vagabonds, too, in all parts of England and Scotland, went in daily dread of being seized by the local authorities under Cromwell's orders and shipped to Jamaica, where for the most part as white slaves, they had to perform work that only Negroes in that climate can accomplish with impunity. Criminals from the Gauls, as well as political offenders of all kinds, were shipped out to join the motley throng, among whom the death rate was, of course, prodigious. A great deal of outrage and cruelty, far beyond that Cromwell intended, was perpetrated by individuals exploiting the immigration movement under loose authority at the expense of objects of their personal dislike and vengeance. That the bondage of the Irish servants in Jamaica was no whit lighter than what we have seen going on in Barbados is evidenced by the earliest legal documents in the island. In the first published collection of laws of Jamaica after the act appointed the number of assembly immediately follows an act for regulating servants, wherein the status of the indentured whites is considered in detail. The following points are worth considering. All servants shall have according to their contract and indenture, but where there is no contract or indenture, servants under 18 years of age at their arrival in the island shall serve 7 years, and above 18 years of age shall serve 4 years, and all convicted felons for the time of their banishment. Any manservant marrying without the master's or mistress' consent shall serve 2 years for such offense. All contracts made with servants or slaves to be utterly void. All suits between servants and their masters or mistresses relating to freedom shall be heard and determined by any two justices of the peace without any appeal. And if any servants absent themselves from their masters or mistresses' service without leave, or a ticket from their master, mistress, or overseer, shall for each such day's absence serve 1 week, and so in proportion for a longer or shorter time, the whole punishment not to exceed 3 years. The weekly rations are to be 4 pounds of good flesh, or 4 pounds of good fish. The weekly rations are to be 4 pounds of good flesh, or 4 pounds of good fish, together with such convenient plantation provision as may be sufficient, and the clothing prescribed to be distributed annually consists of 3 shirts, 3 pair of drawers, 3 pair of shoes, 3 pair of stockings, and 1 hat or cap, and to the women proportionably. Edward Long speaks of that Jamaica assembly which was held under the governorship of the Duke of Albemarle, who reached the island in 1687, as being made up chiefly of Roman Catholics, due, as he asserts, to the machinations of one Father Thomas Churchill, a Romish priest who called himself pastor of His Majesty's Catholic subjects in this island. Of the Dukes of Albemarle himself, Long writes, "It has been said by some writers that this Duke was sent to the government of Jamaica as to a sort of banishment for his zeal against popery, but from the foregoing detail of the proceedings, the contrary is evident, and considering the known principles of bigotry of his master James II, it is more credible that he was sent, among other views, to favor the Roman Catholics and persecute the Protestant subjects there. For this design he carried with him a gracious declaration from the king to the Catholics, confirming to them the free toleration and exercise of their religion, in consequence of which they presented a very flattering address to the Duke. Upon his arrival, who received it in the most favorable manner, and conducted his measures afterwards by the advice of their leaders, whom he had taken into confidence." This whole subject requires some explanation, and first of all, as regards to Father Churchill's position in the island, to clarify matters, a little review may be helpful. During the Spanish regime in Jamaica, the immediate ecclesiastical authority was vested in the abbot, the abbacy itself being attached to the Diocese of Santiago in Cuba. After the English conquest in 1655, for 5 years at least a few priests remained with the Spaniards, who still clung to the mountain fastnesses, waiting in vain for the promised reinforcements which they hoped to drive out the English. Father Delaney, S.J., in his History of the Catholic Church in Jamaica, tells us, in November of 1684, Don Santiago de Castillo arrived in Jamaica as the agent of Ascendiento. On his departure 4 years later, he addressed a letter dated at sea, October 25th, 1688, to the Marquis de los Velez, in which, among other things, he says, "I must also inform your excellency that from the day I arrived in the island of Jamaica, I had a public chapel in my house, and although there was no liberty of conscience, I had a church built, capable of holding 300 persons, in which divine services have been held. I am maintaining the priests at my own expense. For a greater validation, I arranged for the dean and chapter of Cuba, sede vacante, to give the title of Vicar General to my chief chaplain, which they did." Father Delaney adds, the priests were 7 in number, and it's interesting to learn that one of them was a holy priest of the Company of Jesus. This is the first mention of a Jesuit priest in Jamaica, but unfortunately his name is not given. Father Churchill was referred to as an English clergyman who had come from London and who had lodged in the house of Don Santiago for 18 days. The clergyman denounced Don Santiago and his priests as traitors to the king, for having introduced the ecclesiastical jurisdiction of Cuba into Jamaica. The church doors were broken open, and the Vicar General was arrested in a prison, and other priests had to seek safety in hiding. This church must have been somewhere in Spanish Town, but we have no further record of its existence. Whence came these 7 priests found in Jamaica in 1684? It seems only reasonable to suppose that they had found their way to the island as bond servants. Otherwise, their presence would have been noted earlier, especially as regards the Jesuits, for Francis Hansen, writing the preface to the first published collection of laws of Jamaica in 1683, expressly states, "We have very few papists or secretaries, for neither Jesuits or nonconformist persons do or can live amongst us. Some few have attempted, but never could gain proselytes enough to afford them sustenance. Though all except papists may freely exercise what religion they please without disturbance, it is difficult to say just what ecclesiastical authority was actually vested in Father Churchill, as we know nothing except his personal assertion or claim to be the chief pastor of His Majesty's Catholic subjects in Jamaica, and it is not even clear whether this claim anteceded his clash with the local Vicar General appointed from Cuba, or followed that event. He certainly came out under the patronage of King James II, but so also did Don Santiago, whose hospitality he had so shamelessly abused. There is no known document that would indicate that Jamaica had been withdrawn from the jurisdiction of the See of Santiago in Cuba. If such a document ever existed, we would expect to find Father Churchill armed with it and showing it to his brother priest, whom he found in hiding at his arrival. Had he done so, they would have unquestionably honored his position, his high-hand mode of procedure, which one questioned not only his prudence, but even his rectitude. In all probability, he came out from England in total ignorance of condition in the island, and took it for granted that there would be no one to question his authority. At all events, we can scarcely regard him as the zealot for the Catholic faith that long would have us believe. Brian Edwards, who is perhaps the most reliable of Jamaica's historians, simply says of him, "With his grace came over Father Thomas Churchill, a Romish pastor, sent out by James II to convert the island to popery, but his grace's death in the revolution in 1688 blasted the good father's project, and Gardner, the Congregationalist minister, refers to him as a most devoted and self-denying Romish priest. To return to the whole question of Albemarle and his relations with the assembly, the cause of trouble was not a religious one at all, but the time-honored dispute about a permanent revenue. Woodson has recently made it clear that Jamaica at the time was divided between the supporters of Lieutenant Governor Molesworth, a man like Lynch, honest, straightforward, but without Lynch's tact and personal charm, brusque in manner, and impatient in opposition, and the followers of Henry Morgan, the notorious pirate, who despite his profession had several times acted in place of the chief executive as Lieutenant Governor of Jamaica, and who was now on peak because on the present occasion he had been passed over in favor of Molesworth. Albemarle and Wastrel himself naturally fell in with the Morgan. With the Morgan element that comprised the most disreputable characters on the island. And furthermore, 22 years before, his own father, the first Duke of Albemarle, had supported the Buccaneers. In the elections that followed, it was natural that the riffraff, who really had no interest in the matter of the revenue, supported Albemarle by fair means in the foul enforced on the island an assembly that passed an act for perpetual revenue, while quickly repudiated by the next elected assembly. This act eventually paved the way for the final agreement between the assembly and the crown, which was effected in 1728, shortly after the arrival of Major General Robert Hunter as governor. Possibly the fact that the only legal outbreak of bigotry that is recorded in Jamaican history occurred at this time may come to associate the religious issue with the Permanent Revenue Bill. But in this case, the Catholics were not the instigators of the bigotry, but rather its victims. We may be pardoned then at going into this matter somewhat in detail. We read in the journals of the Assembly of Jamaica under the date of August 8th, 1729, how Peter Beckford, a member of the Assembly from St. Catherine from the committee appointed to consider of a proper method of bringing over and settling white people in the island, reported that they had this day met pursuant to the directions of the House in order to frame and bring in a bill, and to effect the same had come to some resolutions which they had directed him to report, to wit, that the persons to be brought over should be all Protestants, etc. Later the same day it is reported, a motion being made that a committee be appointed to bring in a bill for securing the island against all attempts that may be had or may be made by disguise, as well as professed papists, by disabling them from holding any office or place on this island. The following day, August 9th, the bill was accordingly introduced. It was read the second time in order to be engrossed on August 12th, and the next day the engrossed bill was read the third time, and the question being put whether the bill should pass, it was carried in the affirmative. Yes, 27, noes 2. Then follows the customary resolve that the bill do pass, and the order that the speaker signed the same, with the appointing of the committee to carry the bill to the council, and a desire their concurrent to returning. The chairman reported they had attended the council therewith and recommended it of that importance to the island, that they doubted not their honors ready concurrence, and given all necessary dispatch. It is worth noting in the first place that of the 39 members of the assembly, only 29 were recorded as voting, and secondly, that no less than 4 Kellys have been elected as members to the particular assembly. John Kelly from the Port Royal, Darcy Kelly and Charles Kelly from St. David, and Dennis Kelly from St. Dorothy. There was also, as we shall see shortly, at least one other member, Andrew Arkdeckney from St. Catherine, who should have been a Catholic, and it is more than probable that the entire bill was aimed against these very members of the Assembly at the instigation of the recently arrived Governor, Major General Robert Hunter, who had already served as Lieutenant Governor in Virginia, 1707, and as Governor of New York, 1709 to 1719. On August 14th, the House is notified that the Council have agreed to the bill, and 2 days later, the Speaker, with the House attending His Excellency, was pleased to give his assent to the bill, and the act only awaited the confirmation of the Crown to be incorporated among the laws of Jamaica. But on October 8th, 1730, Andrew Arkdeckney, to whom reference has already been made, delivered to the Speaker of the House a sworn deposition signed by Patrick Ward of Gray's Inn and dated London, July 14th, 1730, wherein it was asserted that Arkdeckney had been denied appointment as a deputy to execute the office of clerk in the Supreme Court in St. Diego de la Vega, the present Spanish town, principally because Governor Hunter had declared Mr. Andrew Arkdeckney a Papist and a harborer of protector of Papists. The House called on the governor for the explanation, and he replied the next day. In answer to your message of yesterday, I did write to Mr. Delahaye that Mr. Arkdeckney was disaffected and troublesome to my administration here without a cause. As to his religion, I did write to Mr. Delahaye that he was, as I was informed, educated a Roman Catholic, that he had some part of his education in the law under Mr. Sexton, a gentleman of that religion, and further, for I must trust to my memory, not having as yet been able to find out the copy of that letter, that by his conduct I believed him to steal, for that letter was antecedent to his late solemn recantation. After the debate, the House resolved that the said Andrew Archdecny, a member of this House, hath since his being known here, to wit for the space of about 16 years, behaved himself as a true Protestant, and good subject to his Majesty and predecessor, hath given no cause to suspect of being either a Papist or a favorer of Popery. The following day, October 10th, we find recorded a motion of being made that a committee be appointed to bring in a bill to explain an act to prevent dangers that may arise from disguise as well as declared Papists, and a committee was forthwith appointed for the purpose. The subject was debated on October 13th, and on October 23rd, a resolution was passed, 12 yes, 10 no's, that even people coming from England or His Majesty's plantations should be obliged to furnish themselves with such certificates, presumably to prove that they are neither disguised nor declared Papists. By November 12th, however, there was a change of heart, for on that date appears the record a motion being made and a question put whether a committee should be appointed to bring a bill for repealing the act to prevent dangers that may arise from disguised as well declared Papists, passed in August 1729. It was carried in the affirmative. The bill was read for the first time and passed on November 13th. The next day it was read for the second time in order engrossed, and after adjournment for a quarter of an hour, it was immediately read for the third time and passed in due form, and the speaker was ordered to sign it. On November 16th, it was returned from the council with certain verbal changes, and was agreed to in the amended form. Then after another 15 minutes of recess, the re-engrossed bill was approved, and Messrs. Kelly, Herbert, and Phillip were the committee designated to carry it again to the council, and finally on November 20th, Governor Hunter gave his assent to the repealing act. The act as it appears in the final form reads as follows. An act for repealing an act to prevent dangers that may arise from disguise as well as declared Papists. Act 92. Whereas it hath been found by experience that an act entitled An Act to Prevent Dangers that May Arise from Disguise as well as declared Papists, passed on the month of August in the year 1729, have not answered the purposes for which it was intended, but on the contrary already have and may further serve to discourage Protestants well affected to His Majesty's government from coming over to settle in this island, which as the number of white inhabitants are few, may be of very bad consequence to the welfare and safety thereof, if continued, for prevention of which we, your Majesty's most dutiful and loyal subjects, the Governor, Council, and Assembly of this year's Majesty's Island of Jamaica, humbly beseech your Majesty that it may be enacted, and it is enacted by the Governor, Council, and Assembly, and by the authority of the same, that the aforesaid act passed on the month of August in the said year of our Lord 1729 shall be and is hereby repealed and made void to all intents and purposes. As the original act does not appear in the official collection of acts, presumably it was never confirmed by the Crown, and so never actually received the status of an act in the complete sense of the word, that would constitute a law. Nevertheless, its repeal and annulment actually did receive the royal assent, and was forthwith entered into the laws of Jamaica. There is a significant entry in the journals of the Assembly of Jamaica under the date of March 26, 1730. It runs as follows. Quote, at a conference with the council, the 26th March 1730, concerning the most proper methods of settling, strengthening, and securing the island, that the managers at the said conference had unanimously resolved that the three things of the greatest importance and the most immediately necessary were: 1, the bringing over of white people; as to the first, it were their unanimous opinion to have boys and girls of 7 years old and upwards brought over at the public expense and supported and provided for by the public to bound to the inhabitants at the apprentices, etc. This almost comes like an echo of Cromwellian days. True, no mention is made of how the boys and girls of 7 years and upwards are to be secured, nor is it even hinted that Ireland is to be the source, but it is at least suspicious in the light of correspondence of Governor Hunter as recorded by Pittman, who writes thus of the indentured servants in Jamaica. At the period, they were mostly Irish Catholics, and Governor Robert Hunter thought that as they had no property and were Romanists, they might prove of this service rather than of use in a war with France and Spain. He wrote of them as a danger to the island from pouring in upon us in such shoals as they have done of late years, and he thought their introduction should be restrained. Of course, if they were brought over at 7 years of age, all their difficulties might be obviated. It is only natural to suppose that the bulk of the early Irish in Jamaica must have lost the faith within a generation or two. For after the departure of Father Churchill, there is a break in the records of the Catholic Church in Jamaica of over a century, during which time only a chance priest could have found his way thither, and that too, in all probability, as a bond servant to minister secretly to the need of the dwindling flock until it finally disappeared, leaving to Jamaica a hallowed heritage in the name sanctified by long-suffering Ireland. Pause. So as we can see, because of, once again, of the fighting or the religious fighting that was going on back and forth, that there was a big break when it came down to the Catholic Church in Jamaica, and especially in regards to them keeping up their records. And it was over a century before they actually had another priest in regards to fill in that position. With the abolition of slavery in Jamaica, the House of Assembly offered a bounty for the importation of white immigrants. And while these were chiefly drawn from Germany, one group at least was brought out from Ireland. For in February 1841, 127 arrived from Limerick, but as Gardner tells us, they were brought away with difficulty. For O'Connell denounced the immigration scheme with his vigor, declaring to be nothing else but a system of white slavery, a new wrong inflicted upon suffering Ireland by the Saxon race. The ship, while in the Irish port, was guarded night and day by the police. Only 1/3 of the number she was intended to carry sailed in her, and no steam tug would venture to tow her out of the harbor. Whatever then may be the final conclusion about the fate of the Irish wenches and boys who were ordered by Cromwell to be shipped to Jamaica, a question which, for the present at least, must be left as an open one. This much is certain, that from the earliest days of the English occupation of the island, there was a large proportion of Irish, both Catholic and non-Catholic, in the makeup of the population of that not only Irish names, but Irish blood, as well as widely diffused throughout the island today. It is, then, interesting to find it recorded of Jamaica in the middle of the 18th century that the natives of Scotland and Ireland seem to thrive much better than the European English. They bring sounder constitutions and are much sooner provided for by their countrymen established in the island. And that, brothers and sisters, is the end of Whence, the Black Irish of Jamaica. Hopefully this was an enlightening read. It was pretty fulfilling to me, and hopefully it was fulfilling to you. Hopefully it was able to remove a lot of that confusion and disband a lot of false information, especially based off of the narrative that we have all pretty much have been succumbed to believe and accept. And now, during this time, during the age of revelation or revealing, because this is what's being done, we are having the ability to utilize our common senses to now correct the errors that have pretty much have been done to us. And the only way for you to truly know who you are, to be able to help correct the wrongs that have been done to your lineage, you must do your due diligence regarding your family genealogy. And as we can see, based off of the reading from Whence, the Black Irish of Jamaica, the descendants of the Irish in Ireland still maintain the same surnames that they were born with, that they predecessors had, going all the way back to time immemorial. And if that's the case with the Irish, which we know not only the Irish supplanted or planted Jamaica, but it also was the English who were also placed in bondage, as well as the Scottish. And we can also conclude that many other various kingdoms and nations pretty much had people who looked the same, were placed in bondage to people, the so-called West Indies, as well as the British American colonies, which are pretty much one and the same at that time. So with that being said, brothers and sisters, please do the great work. Make sure that you're taking care of yourself. You're looking after your brothers and sisters, because we all are one. And at the end of the day, we must look out each other as the healers and the revealers of the truth of the heavens as well as the earth, as we continue to move forward on this great plane that we call the great human experience. And through this great human experience, we are to be the light, to maintain the order, and be the healers on this planet, and the foundation that's to move forward in perpetuity for those who are to come, to be able to live and to experience what we are all trying to live and experience, and that is heaven on earth. So with that being said, I love you. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe to the channel. Thank you, Brother McGarrell from the House of McGarrell, for stopping by, as well Brother Magnus for stopping by and commenting and giving your piece. And hopefully we look forward for those of you in the future to be able to stop by, to start commenting, start engaging with the family, because we are on a mission, which this is an intellectual movement, and part of that mission is to find all of our kinfolk, as we have shown based off of the reading, who have pretty much been mixed up here in the British American colonies, for us to be able to find ourselves coming back home, so therefore we can inherit what we were due to inherit a long time ago. And with that being said, tune in for the next live. I hope you enjoyed this one. I'm out. Peace.